Happy Halloween! Ooh. What's up, guys? It's currently October, so it is getting very close to Halloween, and today is the first day I will be starting my Halloween series. I know I'm a little late in the game. I've seen some YouTubers already start their Halloween special, but if you've been subscribed for long, you know that your girl is never on time, so yeah. And if you don't already know, my Halloween series is just where I'll be making Halloween videos and scary videos up until Halloween. And I'm super excited this year because this is my first Halloween with you guys. I have some really spooky videos coming up, so make sure to stay tuned. Okay, now that I'm all done talking, I will be doing some more talking. Today, I will be reading you guys some scary stories. So make sure you're all snuggled up in a nice cozy place. And feel free to turn the lights out, if you dare. You all ready? Good. I will be reading to you The Loyal Dog. In an old house on the edge of a dark, smog-filled city lived the Breyer family. Young Alfie, his mother and father, and Ruby, the family dog. One cold October afternoon, when the wind was howling and the streets were empty, Alfie and Ruby were curled up by the fireplace. They were dozing quite peacefully when Alfie's mother burst into the room waving several bulging files. "Your dad just called," she said. "He has to work late, but he's forgotten some important papers. He needs them for a meeting tomorrow. That man is so forgetful," she went on. "I'm surprised he remembers to put on clothes before he goes to work." Alfie glanced at the files, full of complicated diagrams, letters, and documents covered in official stamps. He could imagine his father panicking without them. He gave Ruby a big squeeze, then rose reluctantly to his feet. "I'll take them," said Alfie, brushing a few dog hairs off his clothes. "His office isn't that far away. It shouldn't take too long." "I don't know," his mother started. "It's getting dark out there, and I wouldn't want you running into any trouble. Perhaps you should take Ruby with you, just in case." "Ruby?" Alfie laughed, looking down at the tired old dog. Her breathing was slow and heavy. Her coat looked worn, and he could just see her ribs poking out from under her skin. "No," he decided. "Ruby needs her rest. She should stay here. I've been to Dad's office loads of times. I'll be fine." "Then make sure you take your scarf," said his mother as Alfie slid on his shoes and found his coat. "It's chilly out there, and I don't want you catching a cold." "Don't worry," Alfie replied, grabbing his scarf. "I'll be back soon," and he carefully squeezed the files into his satchel, slung the strap over his shoulder, and set off. Outside, an icy wind was blowing. The sky was cloaked by a layer of murky brown smog, and what little daylight was left was quickly giving way to the yellow glow of streetlights. Alfie's breath puffed from his mouth in clouds as he walked. He paused for a moment to look back at the house, so snug and inviting. Then he burrowed his nose in his scarf, tucked his hands into his pocket, and set off, the heavy satchel bouncing up and down against his side. As Alfie was making his way along, dreaming of his warm fireplace, he noticed something moving out of the corner of his eye. At first, he thought nothing of it. He simply brushed it aside, thinking it was the flicker of the lights, or perhaps a rat scurrying in the shadows. But as he turned the corner onto a new street, there it was again, a glimpse of movement. He looked back in time to see something large and dark vanish between two buildings. A shiver ran down his spine. "It's just my mind playing tricks on me," he said, snuggling deeper into his coat. He carried on, distracting himself with thoughts of Riders of the Range, a radio show set in the Wild West of America that was being broadcasted later that night. By the time he reached the next junction, he was lost in daydreams of daring sheriffs and wily bandits. That was when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, panting. Alfie's heart started racing and his palms were suddenly clammy. "It's just the wind," he muttered. "I'm halfway to Dad's office already, and the sooner I get there, the sooner I'll be back home again." But with every step he took, the panting grew louder and louder until he was certain there was something behind him. He turned sharply, not knowing what to expect, and saw an empty street. There was no one around. The panting had stopped. There was no villain or monster waiting to pounce. Alfie sighed out his relief and carried on. But as he strode ahead, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that he was being watched. Between every building, round every corner, he sensed movement, spied strange shadows, and heard the snuffling of some unseen creature. What he had thought was his mind playing tricks now seemed very real. Alfie picked up his pace, hoping to leave his fears behind. He avoided the shortcuts down the dark alleys and tried to stay as close to the street lamps as possible. But more than once, a low growl from the shadows had him change paths, and he soon lost his way entirely. Finally, he found himself at a dead end, with a high fence before him and buildings on either side. Convinced he had been lured to his doom, his heart started hammering in his chest and sweat trickled down his back. He stood stock still, holding his breath, but nothing happened. Slowly he retraced his steps, peeking around each corner, afraid of what might be lurking there, waiting to pounce. But this time he encountered no moving shadows, heard no ghostly noises. The wind, too, had died down, so that the only sound was the tap, tap, tap of his shoes on the paving stones. By the time Alfie reached a familiar street, he was feeling very foolish indeed. "What will Dad think when I see him?" he wondered. He looked at his watch and saw how late it was. In a panic, Alfie forgot all about the strange events of the evening. He clutched the satchel tightly to his chest and ran full pelt in the direction of his father's office. He sprinted past silent buildings, bounded across uneven roads, and skirted bare trees. Soon his feet were hurting and his breaths were coming sharp and short. "Almost there," he panted, encouraging himself. And then, mid-sprint, a gigantic shadow spilled out from a side street in front of him. It stretched up and out, taking the shape of a beast with a terrifying head and a cavernous mouth. With it came the soft pit-pat of paws on the stone. Alfie could feel his heart beating in his throat. All at once, his dad's office seemed farther away than ever. "What do I do?" Alfie whispered, afraid to move forward, but determined to reach his dad. All he could hear was panting, snuffling, and the pit-pat of paws as the creature drew closer to the main street. Alfie braced himself. He took a step back, lowered the satchel to the ground, and balled his hands into tight fists. "Come on, then!" he shouted, unable to keep the fear from his voice. "I'm ready for you!" It arrived, with the speed of some dark tornado, bounding around the corner so quickly that Alfie cried out in alarm. It leaped at him, and a moment later, Alfie was on his back, pinned down by 4 large paws, while the tongue of a big black dog slobbered all over his face. Not just any dog. His dog. "Ruby?" shouted Alfie, in between wet dog licks. "What in the world are you doing here? You scared the life out of me." He gently pushed the dog away, then rose to his feet and dusted himself off. "So you're the one who's been following me all this time, and look at you! I haven't seen you with this much energy since you were a puppy." Ruby wagged her tail, then jumped a few times and shook her glossy black coat. "You look so young," said Alfie, incredulously, wondering if this really was his dog. The Ruby he had left dozing by the fireplace had eyes clouded with age, so that she could hardly see at all. Yet here she was, staring clearly up at him. Alfie jumped, then a window swung open above them, and a very red-faced woman called out, "Will you please keep the noise down? I'm working up here, and all this shouting is making it very difficult." "I'm sorry," Alfie replied. "My dog followed me and—" "Dog? What dog?" the man interrupted. "Why, Ruby, of course." Alfie turned to point at the big black dog. But Ruby was gone. "She was here a minute ago," he said, looking around for her. Unimpressed, the man snorted and slammed the window shut. Alfie searched around for Ruby, but couldn't see any trace of her. Where could she have gone, he wondered, baffled and amazed by how quickly and completely she had vanished. Woof! Startled, Alfie turned to see Ruby, sitting by his satchel, her head on her paws, looking as though she'd never been anywhere else. "Where? How?" he began, before realizing he was unlikely to get a reply from a dog. He looked around, unsure whether to take Ruby home or to continue to the office. But when he glanced back at his dog, he found Ruby had disappeared again. So had his satchel. Another loud bark drew Alfie's attention to the end of the street, where Ruby was lolloping back in the direction of his house, the satchel hanging from her mouth. "Hey!" Alfie called, running after the dog. He could barely believe it. When he had left her, Ruby could hardly lift her own head, let alone carry a bag like that. Now she was off, running home and swinging it from side to side as if it were lighter than air. "Ruby, stop!" But the dog paid no attention. He ran after her, hoping he could catch up with Ruby before she got too far ahead, but she was too fast, and Alfie was already tired from his fear-spurred sprint earlier. Before he knew it, they were back home. He felt his heart shrink. His entire journey had been wasted. Then he noticed Ruby, bounding up and down by the front door, the satchel lying discarded nearby. She whined and scratched at the door, and looked up at him with big, sad eyes, eager to get inside. Alfie sighed. "Well, at least the house will be nice and warm," he said. Picking up the satchel, he unlocked the door, swung it open, and immediately recoiled as the stench of something burning hit him. Before he could stop her, Ruby darted inside. "Ruby!" Alfie shouted after her. Quickly he covered his mouth with the sleeve of his coat and followed her in. The hallway was dark, and the only light he could make out was a bright red glow coming from the living room. When he went to investigate, Alfie gasped. A log from the fireplace had somehow fallen from the grate and was now burning a hole in the floorboards. Alfie snatched up the fire tongs, lifted the log from the floor, and dropped it back onto the grate. But the floor was still smoking, so he wiped off his coat and started beating the floor with it until the fire was completely out. Then he opened all the windows to let the smoke out and slumped to the ground, exhausted. Alfie must have fallen asleep, because the next thing he knew, his mother was gently shaking him, her face lined with worry. "Are you all right? What on earth happened?" she asked. "I just got home. The place stinks of smoke, and your dad's files are still here." As she made them both a mug of cocoa, Alfie explained everything that had happened that night, from the moment he left the house to Ruby's sudden appearance and his discovery of the fire. When he was finished, Alfie's mother frowned. "You must be mistaken, dear. Ruby had some sort of seizure just after you'd gone, so we raced her to the vet." She paused, sadness washing over her face. "I'm so sorry, Alfie. When we got there, Ruby wouldn't wake up. She's gone, so you see, Ruby couldn't possibly have followed you." There was silence, as Alfie tried to understand what his mother was telling him. How could Ruby be gone? It wasn't possible. He had seen her with his own eyes, but then he remembered how young she had looked, and how mysteriously she had vanished. "I know you probably won't believe me," Alfie said at last, "but Ruby came to find me tonight. She led me home to show me the fire. She was watching over us. Perhaps she always will." The end. Thank you all so much for watching, and stay safe, guys.